American public schools are one of our most cherished institutions. We know this because the vast majority of people in this country have gone through our public schools. Most kids today are educated in public schools, and we think of schools as a great equalizer of opportunity. We look to our schools to teach everything, from how to use scissors safely to how to escape poverty. And we spend a lot on schools overall. And for the most part, it's money well spent. America is still globally a very well-educated nation. We are highly literate, and we have more people going to and graduating from college than ever before. And as we noted in a recent episode last fall, by nearly every metric that matters, our schools are, on average, doing better than ever. And yet, hiding within those averages are troubling equity issues. We have many stories of great success, and then we have schools that are struggling and have been struggling, sometimes for generations. Often these are schools that serve communities where poverty and its associated traumas are concentrated. The issue is we haven't yet figured out how to help struggling schools transform and sustain that transformation over time. And it's not that we haven't tried. We've had federal legislation with fancy names like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. We've had state interventions and county takeovers. We've had research-based intervention programs. We've had consultants and more consultants. We've reconstituted schools where the principal and the entire staff were made to reapply for their jobs, and we've converted struggling schools into charters. Now, most of these reform efforts have had at least some success. And yet we still find ourselves in 2018 with a system of public education with vastly different outcomes by race, class, and other indicators. These, not surprisingly, are outcomes from a system with similarly varying levels of funding from district to district and even school to school. To put a number on it, a 2016 study from Stanford University concluded that 6th grade students in schools and districts with the highest concentrations of poverty score on average more than 4 grade levels below children in the richest districts in our country. So, if schools are a bedrock public institution, and we already spend a lot on them, and the vast majority of us use them and like them, then why have we had such a hard time helping our most struggling schools improve? And what can we do to fix this persistent issue? All right, welcome everybody to today's seminar. I am so excited. We have a fascinating set of guests for you all today. Immediately to my left is Dr. Ian Guidera. Ian is the Chief Academic Officer at the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. Ian's had a 20-year career in education, working as a teacher of all grades and subjects between kindergarten and 8th grade. He also has been a school leader out here in South Los Angeles and previously led a school turnaround center for West Ed as well. To Ian's left, we have Ryan Smith. Ryan is the Chief External Officer for the Partnership. Ryan has rejoined the Partnership recently after a stint at Education Trust West. Ryan has also the distinction of being the founding director of the Family and Community Engagement team at the Partnership as well. So welcome back, Ryan. And last but not least is Joan Sullivan. Joan is the CEO of the Partnership for LA Schools. Joan is a former high school social studies teacher, a founding principal of a high-performing public high school in the South Bronx, and former deputy mayor of education here in Los Angeles. So welcome to all three of our guests. We're excited to have you here because it's hard for me to think of three better minds to have in one room to talk about our topic today, which is around transforming struggling schools. And so, we live in America, the richest country in the world, and yet we have schools that have persistently struggled. So to start off with, Ryan, I'm wondering if I can throw this to you. Why, in the country that's the richest in the world, do we still have struggling schools?
Well, I think when we think about students who live in poverty, when we think about how we invest in schools, I don't think we've always made the right choices. It's sad that California schools are still in the lowest, I believe, 20 like the lowest 10% of states out there as far as per pupil investment. We know that even with more investment that's coming from the state, a lot of our schools, particularly schools that have been under-resourced for decades, continue to be under-resourced. And we're not making, in my opinion, the right choices. One thing that I think this is a policy issue, absolutely. Where we invest does matter, but I also think it's a belief issue. There are folks who just believe that investing in traditional public schools doesn't make an impact, and somehow the public has, in many ways, lost trust that we are investing in schools the right way. I don't believe that. I see investment, particularly working in partnership, where we're thinking about building the capacity of adults, where we're thinking about wraparound services, where we're thinking about partnering with parents. But truthfully, we're going to have to do some mind shift work and some policy change work in order to invest in students the way we should be doing.
Joan, what do you have to say? Why do we still have struggling schools, even in the wealthiest country in the world?
Because we haven't outlawed private schools. Well, I do think that there is an issue of segregation in our public schools that's persistent, if not worse than it was decades ago, and that is a part of a more systemic set of issues where our resources aren't distributed according to need, and so we are getting exactly the outcomes we should expect to get if we're not investing where the need is greatest. It is inevitable that there will be opportunity and achievement gaps, and I think it is a question of will. How much are we willing to commit to the education of all children as opposed to our children? And I think that those are fundamental questions we have to ask and answer as a society, in addition to the fact that we have a short attention span. And so to the extent that we are making the right investments, we're often not able to sustain our focus for long enough to see the efforts that have been undertaken through. And so that too is, I think, a big part of the challenge that we see in public schools is that because of a parade of superintendents and school board members and initiatives, there's not continuity of effort.
I would add schools are pretty much the most solid institution you could point to that sorts students, right? And we have a well-meaning democracy that most people would describe our country as being operated by. But really, I think it's a caste system where lower-income students tend to end up staying as becoming low-income adults. And they often attend schools where district policies traditionally sort of follow the ideas of mitigating risk and balancing budgets before they are about helping students get to and through college. And I think to Ryan's point, we have to look for policies, sniff out policies that sort of maintain the status quo in that way, and then be courageous about implementing policies that are actually built to do something for those students differently than we currently do.
So Joan, let me ask you, the Partnership for LA Schools is a pretty unique player in this space of transforming schools. What exactly is the partnership, and what makes it different from other efforts nationally to transform schools?
Well, I'll start by saying that there aren't a lot of other efforts nationally independent of the work that districts do every day, because there is a persistent belief that it can't be done. And so a lot of people shy away from the challenge of tackling or meeting the needs of our struggling schools because it's hard work and because the path to success isn't always clear. But from the partnerships perspective, we don't see an alternative. These schools continue to exist. They continue to serve talented children who deserve every chance of success, and so there aren't a lot of efforts out there. We're among a handful of external operators of district schools, and so that in itself distinguishes us. We also are one of the biggest turnaround operators in the country. We have 18 schools, 15,000 students in 3 different communities, Watts, Boyle Heights, and South LA. We also serve feeder patterns, so we serve elementaries that feed into middle schools, that feed into high schools, because we believe that the the biggest opportunity lies in starting with kids when they enter school and seeing them through college, and then also being a part of uplifting communities. The other thing that distinguishes us is that we live in the system, in the second largest school system in the country, and the largest system operated by a school board, one that serves over 500,000 students, not because it's easier, right? It comes with a lot of challenges working in a large bureaucracy, but because it gives us the opportunity to scale. That is to say, we are in a position to address the needs, not just of the 15,000 students that inhabit the schools we serve, but the 500,000+ students who inhabit the larger system, because we can both propose and promote policies and practices that would benefit the larger system.
So, Ian, I think I want to throw this to you first, but how do we create lasting change in schools that are struggling? We've, in many ways, if we look at the sort of national average, our schools are doing better than ever before. We have, the highest or just about the highest graduation rate in history, largest numbers of students moving on and persisting in college, which seems like, we're moving in the right direction, and yet we have these pockets that are very much, experiencing huge gaps in opportunity and achievement with, those averages. So how do we create lasting change in schools that have long struggled?
Well, I think we don't have a ton of knowledge in the school improvement community that would point to proof that there is long-term change that is scalable, right, across multiple schools. So I think a lot of our ideas are untested, but I think in the partnership, we believe it's about building systems in schools and around schools that are focused on building the capacity of the folks who do the hard work of getting kids to and through college every day. If we just focused on finding the rock star principal or the rock star teacher as a turnaround model, then when that person leaves, so goes the talent that they brought with them. So, a lot of our work is figuring out how do we collectively support every role within a school so that folks can do their job well and evolve in it over time. And then it withstands change when you have folks built, their capacity built around systems inside of a school that can withstand talent changes.
Mm-hmm. And Ryan, I know in particular, a lot of the work that you oversee at the partnership also involves leveraging partners and bringing additional resources to schools. And you spoke already at some detail about the huge need for resources. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can add to this, like in addition to the kind of systemic, the building of systems that Ian is talking about, what do you see as kind of the path forward in terms of creating change in schools that have long struggled?
Yeah, so I think the last 4 years as executive director of Ed Trust West, where we talked a lot about how we close opportunity and achievement gaps. And one of the reasons I came back to the partnership is what I realized is we talk about prioritizing the schools that have been historically underserved, but doing that type of work, not only is it hard, it usually comes to that deficit mindset. Well, these communities have so many deficits. Their parents don't care. They work 3 jobs. But what I noticed when I worked at the partnership and now coming back to it is actually these communities have a lot of assets. These parents want to be involved. We're talking about how do we build the structure so that we're welcoming them. How do we ensure that our educators and our principals know what it takes to bring many of our communities back into the fold? Schools can't do this alone. We have to do the asset mapping of community partners and school-based providers who can provide the type of social emotional supports and wraparound services necessary to uplift schools. And I believe that schools are the centers of communities, but they can't do it on their own. So I'm excited to invest in pockets of Los Angeles, to me, that are actually the jewels of LA. South Los Angeles, Boyle Heights on the east side, Watts, these are proud communities that really care. They're historically under-resourced, but care about how their students are doing. And I'd like us to flip the narrative to say that these are the communities that matter the most when it comes to schools, not the communities who've left schools behind, which I just don't believe.
So these, ideas that have been shared so far about building systems and addressing areas that have historically been looked at with a deficit mindset and been under-resourced. Is it realistic that just nationally, that we could bring that sort of change across the board? How do we make this happen in other districts, areas where there is no partnership, there's no intense focus on these communities and bringing them in? How do districts in other parts of the nation even begin with this? Is that even realistic?
I think that comes down to the courage of local and national policymakers, right? So how do we create better policies that are about protecting schools that are in the communities that are the gems of each state and each major city? I mean, you can imagine equity-based policies around training teachers and placing teachers and reinforcing teachers who stay in certain communities. I think there are pockets of these ideas around the country that we can point to, but they're sort of new and untested as like a national model for how to drive federal policy. Doesn't mean we haven't tried with a lot of federal policies over the years, like
Right.
No Child Left Behind, school improvement grants, Race to the Top, all of those things. I think we learned sort of small ideas that might be scalable, but I think one thing that sort of separates out what we believe of the partnership is that long-term sustained investments in school improvement is the way to go, as opposed to how our federal policy making has gone in the past 20 years, which is 3 or 4 years of funds around an idea. And once the funds are gone, the idea goes with it.
Yeah. So, Joan, I'm going to throw this to you first. But, the partnership's had some success. And so why don't we just do what the partnership is doing everywhere? Like, is that the key, or what is the key?
Well, I don't believe that there is any single answer. I in the same way that I don't think large or urban districts or even mid to small districts should be coming at the issues from on high with a single set of solutions. I do think we need to differentiate, right? And that's going to be true by state and by community. And so when I think about the work of transforming public education, I think of the school as the unit of change. So we're not so much trying to create great school systems, but systems of great schools. And that means that you are putting power in the hands of principals and local communities. And I believe that at the district level. I also believe that across the sector. That said, I do think there are some lessons that the partnership can teach other states and districts, among them that it's important to consider a portfolio model where the district isn't the only entity working in the system and running schools, that there are public-private partnerships that can be formed that bring additional resources into the system, additional ideas into the system. And so it's important to say that the partnership is a nonprofit that runs district schools abiding by all labor agreements and working within the constraints of the system so that we can change the system using an infusion of dollars to pilot innovations that we think will benefit our highest priority communities, like the ones that we're serving, which have been historically under-resourced. And so that's one lesson I think we can learn. I think we can also learn from the partnership in the sense that I think a lot of our progress has been the consequence of that continuity of effort, which has been possible because we aren't subject to the changing tides of a school board, right? We can see our initiatives through, and we've learned a lot over time, both from our successes and our mistakes, and that has been a powerful part of the progress. And the other thing that I sort of alluded to, and I'll just come back to, which I think is vital, Ryan spoke to it, is leveraging partnerships. How do we connect our schools to a broad array of resources? A lot of times people say resources aren't the issue, and it's true. We could spend infinitely on our schools and not get great results if we don't marry it with good policies. That said, there's a reason that those of us who have resources are sending our kids to private schools for $30,000, $40,000 a year, and then layering on that the cost of private tutors and everything else, and then the cost of taking our kids abroad or sending them to summer camp or getting sending them in piano lessons. It's because that array of resources and opportunities and experiences is what inspires and engages our kids. And so in order to do that, we need partnerships. And that's something that our organization has been able to do well, is leverage partnerships. And then the third thing is that when you're thinking about the school as a unit of change, it's not just continuity, but each school is dramatically different. And so you have to think about that community individually and figure out how to get to equity, not just in small increments, but in dramatic increments. Each school will need a very different approach. And that applies whether you have 5 schools, 50 schools, 500 schools, or 1,500 schools. You need to be differentiating from school to school.
And I would add, as you think about the school as a unit of change and each school having different needs, you have to still protect schools with policies that ensure they can do what is uniquely needed for each school. And I think that's something that is the other part of the partnership's mission, is we're always looking for the policies that created the conditions that our schools started with when we began working with them, and look for opportunities for other schools like ours so that they can also make their own improvements with their differentiated needs.
So with each school having its own unique set of characteristics and each neighborhood having its own unique set of needs, why not just go the Betsy DeVos route and allow the marketplace and charters to address this problem?
Well, I'll start. Well, number one, if we're talking about whole-scale change in this generation, and we're talking about closing opportunity and achievement gaps for Black, brown, and poor children, truthfully, you can't build enough charter schools to do that, frankly. And the second thing is, even though we've seen some innovations that have come from charters and other groups, truthfully, if we're not scaling back that innovation into the traditional public school system, we're never going to hit the type of change necessary to serve the millions of children across the country. So I think it takes all partnerships types. I think we should be learning from all experiences. But one thing we haven't talked about that's really important, and that doesn't matter if you build an outside system, is that our systems are inherently racist. They are inherently classist. We have to think about, how do we change the belief gaps around if our students can learn and achieve in math and English language arts, that they can be astronauts, coming from Watts and coming from Boyle Heights. Like, those things are the things that matter. And just like we've been calling out our criminal justice system for the ways that it's been created post-construction to mass incarcerate Black and brown people, our education system has been built to undereducate particularly poor people, particularly Black and brown people. And what we need to do is say, well, how can we change this system to benefit those students? And that's where equity really comes in play. So before we start talking about just investing in innovation outside the system, let's really try to change the systems and structures that have been built over decades. And I believe projects like the partnership in district reform efforts are created and designed to do just that. I mean, I'm happy to say that the majority of the principals and assistant principals at partnership schools are people of color. I think that's exciting. People of color who come and understand these communities. That is something that we need to be thinking about. So I'm about investment within the system. I think the partnership does that.
I would add that I don't think the charter movement and charter schools are immune to hegemony, as Ryan spoke of. They're subject to it too. And I often say to people who say, well, charter schools are great or charter schools are bad. The charter schools are kind of like the cereal aisle. And like, you're going into the cereal aisle, you can't just say, well, cereal's good for you or cereal's bad for you. There's good cereal and there's bad cereal. And what we have learned with 25 years of charter schools is that a lot of them open up and they actually are worse than the schools that the partnership got to partner with in the beginning. Some are just a little bit better. And it's not a silver bullet. And we can learn stuff from charter schools, but the majority of our kids are in traditional district schools.
So I want to trouble the waters a little bit here, because
that wasn't troubling the waters.
I mean, it was. I'm going to trouble them back at you. I think in some ways the two ideas, Ryan and Ian, that you just shared are conflicting, in that we have this system that's inherently racist and classist, that's produced since 1609 a certain set of outcomes. And how can we possibly rely upon that system or work within that system to undo those systemic inequities? And isn't there a certain contradiction in there that might imply that an external or market, or however you want to define it, but that some other solution outside the system is going to be required because the system was built to be what it is? How would you respond to that?
I would actually call on Joan to sort of talk about a few policies that the partnership has changed by existing in the space that we live in within LAUSD that we learned were in place, and maybe even district folks didn't really understand because it was just the way of doing things. And we have some around funding, some on staffing, and I think they're sort of emblematic of just what the system does to schools and the possibility for how you can sort of not overly charter a district and transform it from within.
That's a great point. And I'll just start by saying that, first of all, we should be open to radical changes, right? Because what we have isn't working. That said, if we think about, since the sort of question you've set up involves charters, the charter movement, a lot of LA has the biggest charter community in the country, not the biggest proportion of charter schools, but the biggest charter community in the country. And a lot of those charters have slowed or halted growth because there are constraints on what they can do when they get to a certain size. So even if that's your position, even if your thought is, well, let's just expand charters infinitely, we've come up against walls there. And the charter communities, once they get to a certain size, start experiencing some of the challenges that districts experience. And so then you're back at the same point where you need to figure out how to make it work in a larger system. And so what I think Ian was trying to speak to is we live in the system as a partner, but an independent entity, so that we can be a little bit more nimble, a little more flexible, a little more innovative, and think about some of these problems with the perspective that maybe an outsider can uniquely have. And as an example, one that's sort of easy to get your arms around, because we lived in the system, we were subject to all the various aspects of how LA Unified functions. And our schools, for example, did not have students in gifted programs. So fewer than 1% of the students were in gifted programs. The district as a whole has 10+% of its kids in gifted programs. So then the question becomes, why aren't kids in Watts or in South LA or in Boyle Heights in gifted programs? And when we asked the question, in essence, the answer that we got was, our kids aren't gifted. And so, for obvious reasons, being unwilling to accept that answer, we dug a little bit, and it turned out that somebody had to advocate for you to be tested. And because our parents don't necessarily know those programs exist, because we as leaders in the system have all sorts of implicit bias that plays out every single day, the students in our schools just weren't getting tested. So then the question becomes, well, how do you fix that? And again, we're living in the system, so we have to answer that in a way that works within the context of LA Unified. And so what we do is we use 12,000 philanthropic dollars to test all second graders, which is the point at which kids are sorted, and using that modest sum and district personnel, we test all second graders, and it turns out that 13% of our kids qualify for gifted programs. And then the path forward becomes really clear. You need, as a system, to test all second graders for gifted programs. The cost is not prohibitive, and the outcome is one that really gets us a lot closer to equity. And that's just what happened. The district then tested all second graders, and the number of African American boys participating in gifted programs went up, exponentially overnight.
Well, that's great. So, I mean, that's one concrete example of something that the partnership has done and perhaps learned in its years of service. What other lessons have been learned so far in the partnership's work in Los Angeles?
I'll take, for example, 10 years ago, I was tasked with, hey, how do we support schools and getting parents connected to learning what they need to learn to support their children's academic success? We there's assistant principal in charge of family community engagement. We create these family action teams. We call them FAT teams for short. But like the good fat, like avocado for your body, not the bad fat, right? But we also built a program called the Parent College, which was really focused on how do you support parents understanding their 3 R's. We think about their responsibilities, their roles, and their rights. And since that program has began, first it started at Santee High School. We bused parents from Watts and Boyle Heights, and LAUSD teachers, our partnership teachers, taught them on the specifics on what they need to know in order to navigate the system. 10 years, fast forward 10 years later, I'm coming back, 5,000 parents have gone through that program. Now the program that was just in that one site has gone into Watts. Now there's one in Boyle Heights and there's one in South Los Angeles. And a lot of parents are getting on buses every year to go and visit universities across Southern California to learn how they can support their children's success. In fact, I think 1,000 parents and students went to the last university day. And these are some parents who've never stepped foot on a college campus ever. So we're trying to shift the paradigm when it comes to parent engagement.
And it's also been scaled up to other districts and other networks within LAUSD.
So, doing this work is complicated, right? And the pace of growth and evolution at different school sites has not necessarily always been even. So I'd be curious to hear from each of you about what are some of the mistakes that the partnership has made over the last decade that might be valuable to share as good learning for other folks looking to do this same type of work.
I'll start with one. So when you think about LA Unified, it's hard to get it covers 26 different municipalities, over 700 square miles. It's this massive, massive entity. And it has, well over 500,000 students, 85% of whom are low income. And so when you think about that, there's a temptation that plays out all the time of thinking about those schools as all the same, high needs, right? And the partnership said, no, the schools at the very bottom of performance that have been under-resourced most persistently and consistently are very different. So we need to invest resources. And then we got to those schools and we invested them pretty evenly across our 18 campuses. Because it felt like, well, we'd taken this little slice at the bottom, very narrow slice of the system, and so their needs would be met if we infused additional resources pretty evenly. And time has taught us that not only is that wrong, but it's dramatically wrong. And so we've seen progress, but it's not even, right? Our Watts schools' needs outpace those of the schools in Boyle Heights. And our middle schools tend to be more persistently challenged on a host of academic fronts than our other schools. And so I think time has taught us that we have to think even within these narrow slices very differently on a school-by-school basis. And I know I'm revisiting a past theme, but it's important to say we didn't start with that understanding. And as a result, the outcomes are uneven. And with time, we've been able to close even some of those internal gaps within our network. But it's only been when we've recognized the dramatic variability of need from community to community. And one example of that is we have 2 elementary schools, one in Boyle Heights, 100% low-income students, and one in Watts with 100% low-income students. And as sort of one entry point into the kind of differences you might see in those 2 communities, you'd think, okay, sort of similar, right? And of course, they're different in all sorts of ways, but one way to think about it is student mobility. How many students are coming and going on that campus in any given year? So what does that look like in that community? And in Boyle Heights at Sunrise Elementary, 5% of the students are coming and going in any given year. Maybe higher than lots of other communities, but still it's 5%. You go to that school in Watts, 107th Street, and it's closer to 30%. And so if you're treating those 2 schools in the same way, you're not going to get good results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I would add well-intentioned, our team was trying to bridge the digital divide between our schools and, say, a private school or even an LAUSD school on the west side by purchasing technology and blended learning software for our schools. And I think we quickly learned that with the capacity building needs that are so broad in schools, with just implementing software or implementing curriculum, that software, using the technology well, that just putting the technical stuff in schools isn't a solution for helping students with proficiency, reading well, that sort of thing. So, we've learned that schools have to want the technology, have to be prepared to do the learning around it, have to have built a culture where technology is taken good care of, and that it's integrated into an instructional vision inside of a school, and so that you just don't have wonderful technology around the school, student licenses for all kinds of programs, and nobody using it and using it well. And I think that's something you see in districts in general, and sort of speaks to the need for organizations and like ours and traditional districts to really be focused on capacity building first instead of just buying stuff.
So as a classroom teacher, I'm in the midst of my 15th year in the classroom. And one of my earliest memories as a classroom teacher is my first staff meeting that I attended. And I was this rookie teacher, and there were some veteran teachers sitting around me, and they told me basically I don't have to pay attention because whatever they're talking about, it's not going to work or it's not going to last. And a lot of classroom teachers are skeptical of pretty much any sort of reform movement because I've seen so many. And I think we could probably make a laundry list of different efforts nationally or locally to transform schools. Why don't big reform efforts seem to work, or at least not as well as we want them to? What's been the hang up? We're in 2019. What's the big hang up?
It's just that. It's exactly that, which is there's no single set of efforts, changes, initiatives, policies, reforms, whatever you want to call it, that are going to work. There was an interview I read recently with some wildly successful superintendent, may have been Florida, and they said, "What's your secret sauce?" And his answer was, "I'm still here," and that's unusual. But when we think about California and the districts that are often held up on a pedestal, there's Garden Grove, there's Long Beach. I mean, I'm sure you can poke holes in their stories as well. But to the extent that they're examples, they are districts that have one thing in common, which is the superintendent who's been over there for over a decade. So the question becomes not so much what the initiative is, but whether or not you have enough time to see it through so that it bears fruit. And you're absolutely right. People are really, really cynical about the efforts that are undertaken because they know that they're going to come and go because of our governance structures and because of a host of other factors. We have a parade of superintendents, and so there's not continuity of effort. And one of the things that the partnership was extremely fortunate to have was founding funders in the form of Richard and Melanie Lundquist, who made a commitment to the partnership. Not just a big commitment, but a commitment over 10 years. So that guaranteed continuity of effort. And then they renewed their commitment for another 10 years so that there's a 20-year horizon. And when I think about the opportunity that sits in front of us, it comes with continuity. And so what I would say, not just to district leaders and board members, mayors, but also to philanthropy, is how do you make a commitment for the long haul? Because that's what gets us results.
I would add, from like the teacher seat in a PD, the end user during a lot of the national reform efforts has been tons of money focused on lower performing schools, and it means more consultants who go to the PD and run the session that you're sitting in that may or may not feel useful to you, right? And I think over multiple years of those experiences in lower performing schools, teachers sort of feel like, well, this too shall pass, right? I'll be here, the consultant will go away, the funding will go away, and I will still teach my kids in the school that I've been at for 20 years. And so when you think about how to help the end user, the teacher who cares deeply about their school being a better place for kids, right? I think one thing the partnership has learned over our first 10 years is that really the capacity building isn't just about the principal. It's all the teachers being leaders within the school and having a role in fulfilling the vision that they're trying to create, right? And so if you don't sit in PD where your colleagues are leading it, because we've all agreed on a set of goals and strategies to implement that year, and they take your feedback and they're checking on what you learned and you're pushing for the same things, you become immune to the consultants and they just come in and out, and we end up where we've been.
And just to add to that, I 100% agree that oftentimes it feels like a lot of these policies are done to communities and not with communities. And we advocate through these policies on behalf of communities without paying respect to the partners, the teachers, the principals who've been there. So what I appreciate about the work that the partnership has done and other reform efforts, I think we're not just thinking about top, we're not saying top down, here's what you need to do. We're really thinking bottom up. How do you build the capacity of the leaders who already are in these communities? Because they'll be here over the next 10 years, the next 20, 25 years. How do we partner with the folks who have the institutional knowledge about how the communities work? How do we ensure that parents who probably went to these schools come back to support their students and their success as well? And how we pay honor and respect to the school leaders and teachers who do the work every day on behalf of those folks. So investing in adults and connecting resources, doing this from a bottom-up approach, I think is the most sustainable way that you'll see reform actually scaled.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great note for us to end on. I want to thank our three guests today, Ian Guidera, Ryan Smith, and Joan Sullivan, all from the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools. And even though this episode is ending, I have the distinct privilege of seeing these folks at work on Monday. So I consider myself lucky. But also, all of our viewers can check out our episode extras. We're going to have one-on-one interviews with all three of these folks. So much more to check out on our website, which is aotashow.com.